Tonight we are joined by Barb Sommer, who is a Minnesota native and has been an oral historian for over 30 years. She has served as a historical organization director and director or co-director for numerous oral history projects, has led oral history workshops, has taught oral history at the post-secondary level, and has presented at state, regional, national, and international conferences. She is a longtime member of the Oral History Association, where she has served in several volunteer capacities. Sommer holds degrees from Carleton College and the University of Minnesota, and currently lives and works in Mendota Heights, Minnesota. Her book, Hard Work and a Good Deal, traces the history of the Civilian Conservation Corps and won numerous awards, including the 2009 Minnesota Book Award and the 2009 Award of Merit from the American Association for State and Local History, and has just been reissued in paperback. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Barb, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Abby. Can you all hear me okay? Everybody hear me? Great, thank you. Good. I'm so glad to be here tonight to be talking about the Civilian Conservation Corps. This has been a project that you mentioned that I've done various oral history projects. The CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps project in Minnesota, was probably one of the first big projects that I did, along with several others, when we lived in northern Minnesota. And I remember when I got a phone call one day. I was actually running the Carleton County Historical Society many years ago. And a friend said, let's just do some interviews about the CCC. And I sort of said, what's that? Little did I know that I'd be still working on the history and working with it and write the book and everything many years later. But we said we'd do about 10 interviews, and wouldn't that be wonderful? And we ended up doing 100 interviews because we happened to hit things at the right time. And there were so many people on so many different sides of the CCC story who wanted to participate that they would just come to us.
Shot I got.
And so we did end up with all these interviews. And then I said I'd like to write a book about it. And that took a long time too, as a matter of fact. But I did want to try to use and work the stories of the interviews into the book. And that's what I did. And so the book is sort of divided into two parts, and that'll be how I run the PowerPoint tonight, or the program tonight. First, talking about sort of the social history side of things. What was the need and who was involved in the CCC, and a little bit about that background. And then I'll talk about the work that was done in southeastern Minnesota and the camps that were scattered all around southeastern Minnesota, and the work that was done there. So I will, the book is titled Hard Work and a Good Deal. The Historical Society published it, Minnesota Historical Society, and they titled it, but we worked in the term good deal because most of the interviews, not all of them, but most of them, if we said to the interviewee, especially to the enrollees, or the young men who were part of the CCC, what your memories, they would always say it was such a good deal. So we wanted to make sure that phrase was included in the title. And so the book became Hard Work and a Good Deal, the Civilian Conservation Corps in Minnesota. So we all know, I can talk a little bit about the Great Depression. We all know that this was a very difficult time in world history and United States history. People would refer to it as hard times. I always think that's probably a great understatement, that it was much more than hard times. Unemployment ran at 25% generally across the board, and at 50% among the young men who became part of the CCC. Companies that were surviving were cutting people's pay, cutting hours. The CCC enrollees remembered sometimes that they didn't get into the CCC right away because there were 8 kids in the family and their father had 1 day of work. And that was enough to say, no, you aren't in as great a need as others. So, but family income dropped by about 40%. So things were tough. These are photographs from the book. This is something in 1937, a demonstration in 1937. And I pulled it in because this young man, this child or young boy there is saying, how can we grow if we don't have enough to eat? And there was concern about the amount of people couldn't buy milk, they couldn't buy meat, they grew big gardens trying to, hang on, lost homes. It was, of course, a difficult time. So That sets up what we're going to be talking about. Rochester at the time looks like a pretty thriving community, and it probably was. The Mayo Clinic at that time was beginning to do its work with a group medical practice. And I was trying to look into more in the Rochester history, but I think there was a little stability there. But overall, the area, even southeastern Minnesota, was pretty hard. It was hard hit by just problems of soil conservation, among other things, and loss of land. So the Rochester street scene, these are fun, just vintage photos. Again, in 1937, a busy community. There we see Rochester in 1939. And somewhere in the background here is the location of the fairgrounds. And I'm pointing that out because that was the original CCC campsite for one of the camps in southeastern Minnesota. So at this time, actually. And I think we found the photograph of it based on photographs like this. There were some aerial photographs of Rochester in 1939, and one of them showed the fairgrounds, and there was the CCC camp, and I have that. I'll show you that photograph in a minute. But, and so there in Rochester itself, you know, we have actually the city of Rochester and CCC camp right in its outskirts. So what was the Civilian Conservation Corps? It was, according to President Franklin Roosevelt, was elected president in 1932, was sworn in March of 1933, when inaugurations were still held in March. And he had pioneered this, or he had developed this project when he was governor of New York, discussing using young men to do conservation work in the state. And he decided that day that he wanted to try to do this nationally. So he asked his aides to write up a bill to be able to hire young men ages 18 to 25 to work on conservation projects across the country. And in his message to Congress, he said, I propose to create a Civilian Conservation Corps. That wasn't its formal name at the time, but he did call it that, to be used in simple work. This was work that they could get started immediately, which they did, not interfering with normal employment. The unions I think had a voice in that, and others, and confining itself to forestry, to the prevention of soil erosion, flood control, and similar projects. I call your attention to the fact that this type of work is of definite practical value, not only through the prevention of great present financial loss, but also as a means of creating future national wealth, which is something we can reflect on today. So the legislation was passed 10 days later. This was not a slow process. It went to Congress on March 21st and passed on March 31st. With that, the Civilian Conservation Corps began to take shape. The funding came through an executive order. I think it was on April 5th. It was very early in April. And by the next couple of weeks, the first CCC camp, I believe it was called Camp Roosevelt, was up and running, or was beginning to take shape in the state of Virginia. And by that spring, there were camps all over the place. There were camps in Minnesota, there were camps across the country. It's considered, it was a work relief program. I'll talk about that a little bit more. It was the combined the importance of giving work to people with helping people who had qualified for relief, which was the somewhat informal program to help people who needed help prior to the Great Depression. It was a conservation program, not an environmentalism program, but a conservation program. Its motto was basically the greatest good for the greatest number. So you'll see that even though they're planting trees, sometimes therefore they would say, well, we know these will be cut at some point and harvested. when they worked with state parks, which was the third arm along with forestry and soil conservation, that the CCC worked greatly in. It was to develop the parks, to put in hiking trails, to put in campgrounds, that sort of thing. So the purpose and the focus of the conservation work was the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And that was the Civilian Conservation Corps. I'll go into this a little more later. It did not have a large bureaucracy, but it relied on existing organizational and administrative groups in place. And so it relied on the United States Army to run it, and it relied on conservation programs and work in the states. And so the Department of Conservation, for instance, in Minnesota, to administer the work programs. So that also helped to get up and running fast, because it pulled in existing and available work programs that could be put in place pretty quickly, and administrative structures that were already in place. So this is what happened. Over the 10 years from 1933 to 1942 or 43, it was defunded during that period. There were about 500,000 people, or mostly young men, were involved in the CCC in 2,600 camps scattered across the United States. This is the 10-year map, so you can see it was a pretty intensive program, well used, it was popular, it was well used by states and by organizations wanting to do conservation work across the country. In Minnesota, you can see Minnesota, right? Look at Minnesota there. That you can see the pattern there, and you can see it in more detail here. Minnesota's CCC camps worked in forestry, state and national forestry. Look at northern Minnesota there. You can most certainly see where the camps were, all up and across the top of the arrowhead part of the state, and then spreading out into the central part of the state. They also set up worked with state parks. And so some of the camps, especially those scattered around, are state park camps. And then in southeastern Minnesota, there's a real concentration of Civilian Conservation Corps camps working in soil conservation in the southeastern part of the state. And that was the pattern for Minnesota. It was a pattern for a lot of states. It was definitely Minnesota's pattern. State forests, state parks, and then the soil conservation in the southeastern corner of the state, primarily. The camps would move around a lot. They were staffed by young men who were formed into companies by the United States Army, which ran the camps, and they would move around a lot. So there may have been several companies at one camp as companies were moved in and out. There was a lot of activity going on with the CCC, but that's the pattern of the camps. So Franklin Roosevelt actually came to Rochester to talk about the importance of the soil conservation work. He was invited to come, and there he is, a photograph of him speaking on August 8th, 1934, a very hot day. Our interviewees, some of them from who had served in southeastern Minnesota, remembered that day. But in reading from the book, he said when he was in Minnesota, he received dozens of requests from area farmers saying, "Please help us bring soil conservation techniques to southeastern Minnesota," which is what did happen. And he helped spotlight the importance of soil conservation in the state by bringing this speech to Rochester. And one of the men who was in the camp, the young men who was in the camps, the CCC enrollees, by this point in 1934, there were a number of camps in southeastern Minnesota, and the enrollees were asked to come and be his honor guard. And so one enrollee, and I'll just read this quickly, Roosevelt said, "They drilled us pretty hard. We were going to be the honor guard. We rode in trucks from our camps with no canopy over the top just benches. It was the hottest day of the year, and they had wool uniforms on. I was put right opposite where Roosevelt was with his convertible. I could have stood there for, I must have stood there for an hour in the sun. He had a big smile for everyone, terrific showman. He was the man of the hour. When it was all over, we had to ride back to our camps in the hot sun. It was one of those days I am proud of. I was there for it. And so there, you can see the sense of pride that the Civilian Conservation Corps was starting to, there was a sense of pride among most of the enrollees in the work, and the fact that they were involved with this, that it was a program that Franklin Roosevelt supported, personally supported, very much liked, and that they were part of it. Now, as I said, the Civilian Conservation Corps used existing organizations and existing institutions to run it. The Army ran the camps. So this is General Stone in 1937, the Minnesota director from the Army, with some of the staff. But the United States Army ran the camps, and so they would make sure that the enrollees were fed, that they used Army, they were given clothing from the Army, they were given food from the quartermaster at Fort Snelling, and then they also had their own sources of food in the areas that they lived in. But they were, and they were, everything that they were given to be housed, to live in the CCC camps came from the Army. And the Army organized the camps into companies. So a 200-person company would be assigned to a camp. So that each camp had about, ideally, 200 young men in it. And that was all the structure of the United States Army. When the companies were moved around, it was the Army that helped do that. But the work that was done was done by the departments of conservation, or in the case of the camps in southeastern Minnesota, by the Soil Conservation Service. The man in the center of this photo is Robert Fechner. He was the national director of the CCC until he passed away later in 1939. But he ran this, and with all its flaws, or with all its benefits and its flaws, Fechner had very clear ideas about what he wanted the CCC to do, and he wanted it to support young men, especially young white men. He was a Southerner. The two people on either side of him, on the left, we have Harold Lathrop, who ran the state park system, and on the right, Grover Conze, who ran the Forest Service system for the state of Minnesota. So they were responsible for the work programs for the camps that were going on in Minnesota, and for making sure that these 200 young men in each camp had enough work to do. There was a reason that the conservation CCC camps were needed, and this is a photo from a parade in Wyckoff, Minnesota. Said, "Our soil has gone, so we must go." The southeastern Minnesota was particularly prone to erosion, especially to water erosion. 46% of Minnesota's land area was affected by erosion at this point. But the driftless area of southeastern Minnesota was hardest hit, and you saw the pattern of camps in the driftless area, especially with water erosion. There was some wind erosion as well. But the counties of Houston, Fillmore, Winona, Olmsted, Wabasha, and Goodhue were the counties where the great concentration of Soil Conservation Service CCC work program camps were developed. And there was that was the need, that was the recognized need. So where were the camps? I have 3 slides here with names of camps on them, so you can read through them. The dates are the dates that the camps were running. In some cases, as in Caledonia, for instance, a camp would start up, stop, there'd be more work, it would start up again, stop, and then a work program might become more established, and you'd see that it have, as Caledonia has from 1935 to 1942, when the CCC ended, then a continuous run of work in that area where there were enough work programs, enough established and accepted work programs to keep the young men busy. And you see that skip through here. We have more. Jordan's a little bit further out, Lake City, but Lanesboro was another well-known camp, Civilian Conservation Corps camp, Lewiston, Plainville. And this is the last slide. Rochester, the Rochester camp, the camp that was on the fairgrounds at Rochester, was the sub-district headquarters for southeastern Minnesota. So it was, in addition to everything else, a headquarters camp for the state, which meant that it had some supervisors, some additional administrative work to do. But the others were soil conservation camps. SCS means soil conservation. PE means that it was an erosion camp. And then eventually took on the Soil Conservation Service designation. Those were the camps, where there were also 2 camps for state parks in southeastern Minnesota, both of them to build Whitewater State Park. And so SP would be state park, you'd see SP, and then some preliminary district designations, but SP would mean state park, when that would be the designation for those camps. And what did they look like? The man whose quote I read to you was from this camp, the Hoka camp, also Houston. Or is that Houston or Houston? I never remember how to say that, but the camp in that area, and you can see the hilly terrain behind that they were working with in southeastern Minnesota. Waterville, the camps looked a lot like little Army camps, because that's what they were. Barracks would dominate, the barracks would dominate. There'd always be administrative, some administrative, and then some basic working garages and other buildings for working with the equipment and everything that they needed. But the barracks were they were very neat. The Army kept them, you can tell the difference between these and some other camps from the WPA. These were incredibly neat camps. The Army kept them enrollees busy all weekends and on off times, educating them. There were education programs in the camps, and then providing other sources of help or other activities in the evenings and stuff, but also just maintaining the camps. A lot of the camps by this point were portable. This looks like a portable camp, which means it could be taken apart and put on a truck and moved to the next location. But here's the Lanesboro camp, as I said, one of the long-standing ones. Here's the Plainview camp. It had a slightly different style. The roof style is different. That was way toward the end of the CCC. And here's the Rochester camp on the fairgrounds. You can see the racetrack here. This the CCC Minnesota office here on the left-hand side, lower left-hand side, is see, I don't know if I can't point to it. Well, I can try. Here it is. I can try to point to that here. That's now, I think that that building still stands, and it's the fairgrounds office. And so you still have that building standing on the site of the Rochester CCC camp. But there you can see the barracks again. You can see some of the office and some of the other working buildings for the Civilian Conservation Corps. This is the camp, the Whitewater camp, the state park camp in the winter. Again, the row of barracks and then some of the administrative and the work buildings. The Army would have 2 or 3. This is the Rochester camp early on. The Army, the United States Army, would have 2 or 3 Army officers, usually reserve officers, pulled in as reserve officers and returned to active duty so that they could run the camps. The captain would, in the center here, would be the person who was the top person at the camp. There would be a medical doctor, usually a reservist again, the man on the left, and then others to support him. And then the other side of the Army officers lived in the camps, and then the conservation officers lived nearby. Usually, they weren't living in the camps. But here you have a number of conservation officers there to guide the work of the young men in the camps and to get the conservation work done. Again, this is the Rochester camp. So who were the enrollees? They were young men, ages 18 to 25. They were unmarried. They were some needed education in some cases. Many had to drop out of high school, and so there were programs where they could get their GEDs. Eventually, that became part of the CCC process. They were paid $30 a month, and 25 of it went straight to their designated dependents. So that check went home to the whomever they designated as their dependents, and they were allowed to keep $5 a month. But as they used to say in the interviews, $5 went much further then than it does now. In fact, during the Great Depression, during the $30 that they were paid would have the buying power now of about $650. So this really did make an impact on people's lives, and on the lives of these young men and their families. It was a program that made a huge, provided stability for the families. They were often the breadwinners in the families, actually, if their parents, if their fathers were unemployed. They were in the enrollment periods were for 6 months, and so, but that is the Great Depression as things began to, there were more camps and there was more flexibility in coming in. They were allowed to re-up, as it were, to go in and ask for another assignment for another 6 months at a time. They were primarily white young men. But I'll just quickly give you a little snapshot of Minnesota. Most of the enrollees were white. There were also mixed camps in Minnesota for Minnesota's Black enrollees, and that would be there would be about 10 enrollees at a time who would be assigned to a white camp, a camp with 190 or so young white men. And those were mostly in northern Minnesota. There were also some Black camps that were moved from central southern states, Missouri and Kansas especially, to Minnesota early in the history of the CCC. That did not last long. It wasn't a successful program. It was the northern tiers of states. That was true of a bunch of northern tiers of the states, including Minnesota. It did not work very well. And after that, the camps for the young Black men and the enrollment for young Black men was always capped at 10%. We're down in the southern states. But for a while, there were a couple of Black companies, full companies of Black enrollees in northern Minnesota. There was also in 1933 or 34 a tent camp, meaning it was just up for the summer. In Preston, on the Preston Fairgrounds. I think the enrollees came in from Iowa, and it was a partial mixed camp with 52 Black enrollees. It was there for just a short time. Minnesota also had veterans camps and there was a program within the CCC for World War I veterans who were destitute. And actually the Rochester camp was a veterans camp. So it was a camp for World War I enrollees who did the same work and were given the same pay and everything, but were allowed to come in their own camps. And then there was, in addition, and I won't go into this, but except to mention that there was the BIA, John Collier, director of the BIA at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, looked at the Civilian Conservation Corps and the benefits that it was bringing to young men and said, I'd like this for Native American people. And so the BIA developed what was called the Civilian Conservation Corps Indian Division. And there were CCC Indian Division camps scattered on the reservations across Minnesota. So this was, even though it was predominantly white, there were a number, it was a little more multicultural, so we say, there was more to it than just the white enrollees. But in southeastern Minnesota, except for the Preston camp, I think everything was pretty much a white. These were the camps. These were the enrollees in 1934. You can see they were given work clothes. Their dress clothes were actually outdated World War I uniforms, but there are many of these pictures, the rolling camera pictures, showing the company of 200 young men who were working in the camps. This is the veterans camp. These are some of the men who would have been in the Rochester camp. And they did have fun. And here's Rochester winning all its games, the Rochester Veterans Camp, winning all its kitten ball games in 1934, I believe that is. So what I will do now is that was the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was set up as a program for young men. It was set up so that young men could have work, could help support their families, and so that they could get experience in the work. And it was set up so that the conservation work that they did was really basic. It was stuff that could start quickly. It was stuff that they could be taught, and that they could benefit the land areas that they were working in. The programs were had to be approved. They were on a for a camp to have for a camp to be located in a certain place. They had to have a very specific work program. They had to know what they were going to be doing in that area and why. And then the enrollees would be brought in to actually do the labor under the direction of the conservation officers. Sometimes men would be brought in from the local community, so who had specific experience, especially stone cutters. And there were a lot of stone buildings built in the parks, and stone cutters would be brought in to teach the young men and to help them with that kind of a technique. But for the most part, they were the local experienced men, as they were called, were helped teach the enrollees how to do the conservation work. And that was the purpose of the Civilian Conservation Corps. And so the CCC is known for some of the conservation work it did. It's still remembered for some of the conservation work it did today. Tree planting was something that was known across the country. The Civilian Conservation Corps was known for planting trees. Most of the trees were planted in Minnesota were planted in the northern parts in the state and national forests, which often expanded their boundaries during this time period. Took in more land. Tax forfeit land would be turned back, would be developed into state and national forests, and the trees, tree planting was a major effort in those areas. But there was tree planting in southeastern Minnesota as well. I'm not quite sure where this is, but you see that it was holding the soil in place. These trees are pretty close together, but that's the way it was. There was a lot of monoculture. These may be little red pines. If you go around the state and you see red pines all in a row, chances are you're looking at a CCC planted area. Nationally, the CCC the CCC enrollees planted about 4 billion trees during the 10 years. So this was a major part of its effort. They were nicknamed Roosevelt's Tree Army. That was one of the nicknames because of that major effort that they put in. In Minnesota, they planted, let's see here, 123,607 trees is the count that came back. So about a quarter million of trees, over about 124 million trees basically were planted in Minnesota during the CCC. That was a major part of that effort. They planted in state parks or conservation areas, our national forests and our state forests. CCC also fought forest fires, something that we could use today. They built fire towers. There were a lot of fire towers scattered across northern Minnesota primarily, but there was a lot of forestry work that was done in addition to planting trees. And fighting fires was another thing that was a very important part of the CCC work during its 1933 to 1942 during its years of existence. The soil conservation work. We think of terracing. There was a lot of terracing done in southern Minnesota. There was a lot of it, but there were areas in southeastern Minnesota where water erosion was a concern because of the steepness of the driftless area, the steep hills and everything. And so we have a lot of accounts of the work of the CCC in that area, saying that this was the type of work along with terracing that was done. And here you see an erosion dam going in near Chatfield. These are probably covered over now. You probably don't even know they're there, but this type of work was done throughout southeastern Minnesota, working with attempts to try to control the water erosion or the concerns with washing the soil away during that time period. Here's another erosion dam. This is a real simple one. You can see it's very simple. Actually, years ago when the book first came out and I gave a talk, I think down in Rochester, someone looked at that. There were enrollees who were still, we've lost them now, but who were still in, they were still with us. And and one person I remember during this presentation I gave said, "Oh, I know right where that is." He remembered working on it, and he said, "You'd never know it was there now." He said, "It's all covered over. The land is, it's been conserved, but underneath it all is this little erosion dam that the CCC built to help prevent the water erosion and and to help conserve the soil that way in southeastern Minnesota." They quarried limestone. The enrollees, there's a number of enrollees that quarried limestone, which they help use to help the farmers retain their soil. I think the quality of the soil. And so that was another activity that was done in southeastern Minnesota. And then they worked hard as they had asked Roosevelt for help with this kind of help us bring work in so that we can better improve the use of our land and our farming techniques. And so this was the type of work that was done, was the terracing. Generally with something like this, when the CCC enrollees worked on public land, that they worked on the public land, for the state forest. In a situation where they were working on private land, that was the support came from the farmers and from the Civilian Conservation Corps. And so the farmers would often pay for some of the supplies that were needed, and then the enrollees would, under the direction of the conservation workers and the local experienced men, would actually do the work for the farmers. The farmers had to sign up, and then they had to commit to be able to say, yes, I'm going to keep this up for X number of years. They had to make a commitment, and there were contracts for this type of work that was done in southeastern Minnesota. And so you see this terracing. You can see an example of the kind of contour farming that was going on, still using horses in 1938, or the practices, as you can start to see the common practices here near Wabasha in 1940. I don't know if these were CCC done work, but they most likely could have been, with the type of terracing and contour farming that was done, because that's the type of work that the Civilian Conservation Corps enrollees would do in southeastern Minnesota, help lay it out and put it in. And then it was up to the farmers to maintain it as well. But this was a very large area. This was probably the crux of the work by the Civilian Conservation Corps in southeastern Minnesota, was the work with the farmers and contouring and terracing, and making sure that and helping the farmers. So you see that this is a photo from the book again, just the patterns that you can see on the hillsides. It's a good example of the kind of work that was done. In addition, in southeastern Minnesota, there was the state park work, and these are enrollees. I'm not sure what they're doing unless they're also working on some soil conservation work at the state park. But you can see they're hard at work here. They were there for just 2 years, 1933 and 1934. And they did do soil conservation, as you can see here, they did do soil conservation work as a little dam. Looks as if they were pouring concrete in the winter, which they could have done. And here they are all sitting there enjoying showing off their work and showing what they were able to do at Whitewater State Park. So again, there's some work that was being done there. Nationally, the Civilian Conservation Corps, there were 711 state parks created. In Minnesota, the number of state parks went from 30 to 47, and I think Whitewater may have been one of the newer ones, but they increased the number of state parks through the work of the Civilian Conservation Corps. So they expanded the state park system and the work of these CCC enrollees. The enrollees put up buildings, developed campgrounds and trails, did this kind of work in Whitewater, and again, helped develop the state park system for the state of Minnesota. And here, this is a photo from the Whitewater State Park. This is from the state park bulletin, actually, but identified as a picnic shelter built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. You can see the stonework that they would have been taught to do, but that was also the work that those enrollees did during the 2 years that the camps were in, that the state park camps were in southeastern Minnesota. So there was a structure, an infrastructure built at Whitewater that the Civilian Conservation Corps enrollees helped put in place. So what was the result of all of this work? Well, I should mention a couple of other well-known places, and I'll talk about the result. The Department of Natural Resources building on the state fairgrounds was built by the CCC, and the stone little path across the Mississippi River with a dam underneath it, actually. The headwaters of the Mississippi River as it looks today was a CCC project. So there were some well-known projects, but for the most part, what the enrollees did was the basic work that needed to be done to help conserve the land in Minnesota. So what was the result? At the time, the state estimated that the work value of each enrollee was $664 for the 6 months that they were in the CCC. That'd be about $15,000 in today's dollars if I've done that right. They said the benefit to the state was $51 million overall in the 1930s. That what comes out to 1.1 trillion. I've got that right, but the benefit was there. That future benefit, that future wealth that Franklin Roosevelt anticipated, President Roosevelt anticipated, this was the result. That the overall value of the work that the employees did, that these enrollees did for their $30 a month was about $51 million over the life of the CCC in Minnesota, across the state. Dependence payments in Minnesota, about $17 million was sent out. And of course, that translates to something like $360 or $70 million in today's dollars. In other words, it made an economic impact on the state and an economic impact on the families. So I said these young men might have been the sole wage earners of their families. That was often the case with the Civilian Conservation Corps enrollees. The total cost over the 10 years, 9 to 10 years, was $3 billion. That averages out to about $6.3 billion a year in today's dollars. So there was a benefit that did cost. That was the cost of maintaining, of bringing the program in and maintaining it. But that was the value back to the to people of Minnesota, and the continuing value through the work that was done continues to help us with the benefits and support the state of Minnesota. One of the young men whom I quoted said, when talking about the value of the CCC, said, "My dad died when I was 15, and I went into the CCC when I was 18, the first year he was allowed to do that. That $25 made the difference to my mother and the 5 kids still at home." So you think about what today seems like a small amount of money had huge buying power at that time and really did help. Many enrollees learned to trade. They got work experience, which they used after leaving the CCC. One of the men we worked with became a map maker and cartographer, and that was his career. He ended up learning it. When asked about the value of the CCC to the enrollees, they all remembered the beauty of the areas wherever they were that they worked in, and the support giving that it gave them at a very critical time and a difficult time in their lives. One man said, I knew a lot of guys that gained 15 to 20 pounds in the 6 months they were in. They could have 3 meals a day, as much food as they wanted. They went in looking weak looking, and in 6 months they were rugged and tan and strong and healthy. And a lot of them echoed that kind of thing. They remembered it as a safe place almost for them, and a place where they could get that kind of support. So it wasn't a perfect program. Especially with the need among Black families, capping it at 10% of the CCC throughout has been one of the criticisms. It was obviously a product of its time that may have been a little forward-looking at the time. We look back on it now and we say that was definitely a hardship for people who could, but families who were not able to have as much access to the CCC as the white enrollees. But it has often been described as a good deal, as I said at the beginning, a good deal, and it's recognized today as the largest conservation program in US history, and that's the cover of the book, the reissued book. But we do have state programs today. Many states have programs. We don't have a national program anymore. We have the states states want to set up programs, they can. Minnesota's program is a kind of an independent program sponsored with AmeriCorps dollars. It's called the Conservation Corps of Minnesota and Iowa, and you might see them up in the Northwoods, especially still doing forestry work. A lot of folks, as they're going through college or looking for jobs, join the program. And I think there are there's men and women now. I don't think there's a 6-month limit anymore, but they can go in and do the same kind of work, and they consider themselves, these young people in the Minnesota Conservation Corps, or the Conservation Corps of Minnesota and Iowa, consider themselves carrying on the legacy of the Civilian Conservation Corps in Minnesota. So I think that's about what I have to say about the CCC. It's still considered one of the probably the most popular of the New Deal programs, and it was considered that at the time. There were efforts to make it permanent. There were a couple of efforts that came very close, but in the end, the Army officers were needed elsewhere as the World War came on. And so it became very, very difficult to find people to run the camps. And the young men, of course, were called up to serve in World War II in the Army, or in the military services. And so in the end, it was defunded. And I don't know, it may still be on the books anymore, but at the end, the funding was just cut off by January 30th, 1942, and it wound down. There wasn't much work being done in 1943. The camps were being dismantled, and the program just wound down. And so it was a product of its time. It served its time well for that decade of the Great Depression. So if you have questions, I would be glad to take them.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. And then Barb, if you want to end your screen, we can all look at each other if anyone wants to raise
That's a good idea.
We can do that too. And I had a question just to kind of kick us off. Oh, my camera's off. That should fix it. Yeah, there we go. So the question I had is, did CCC companies like move across state lines? And then in that case, if they did, the enrollees that you talked to, were they doing labor here in Minnesota, or were they doing labor elsewhere?
That's a really good question. In World War, I'm going to go back to World War I to answer it, and I will answer. This is an important part of the answer. After World War I, the United States Army divided the United States into Army Corps areas, they were called, vertically, north to south. And so all across the United States, there were vertical Army Corps areas. Minnesota was in the 7th Army Corps area. It went from Minnesota down to the southern border, up and down. That was Minnesota's Army Corps area. And with it, the CCC camps most often moved within the Army Corps areas. So there would be men, companies of men, especially at the beginning, because it was easy work. At least that's how I interpret it. Pretty easy work up in northern Minnesota. You could, there was a lot of work to do in the forest. You could do brush clearing. You could do this sort of thing. So there was work for these young men. And so companies of CCC enrollees enrolling early in the CCC were put on trains. And I remember one man who still lived in Cloquet when I interviewed him. He stayed up north. But he said they all woke up the next morning and they saw a sign and it said CLOQUET. And they said, Cloquet, where are we? They had no idea where they were. They had no idea. They just knew that they'd come north. They were told they were going to Minnesota, so that the camps, the companies would move up and down. The company from Preston with the 52 young Black men came in from Iowa, but that would be up and down again. So they go up and down that north-south corridor. And there are some historians who say that Roosevelt had a kind of an ulterior motive. He probably saw war on the horizon. He began to see war on the horizon. And so he convinced the Army to take on the care of these camps, the work in these camps. And that gave a lot of officers experience in working with the young men. It gave the young men, the companies of young men, experience in working in an Army-style setting. And it gave them experience in moving companies around and just all sorts of things. And so when the enrollees, most of them went right into World War II, and they said they would often be made staff sergeants, or they'd be given positions of responsibility because they knew the ropes. They knew how to live in an Army-style setting or a military-style setting. So there was always kind of that little nugget of I don't know if it's true or not, but that little question about the CCC. Was there more to it in Roosevelt's mind than we think of today?
Okay. We've had a couple of questions come in through the chat. So Mary said that she really enjoyed your presentation and wanted to know, is it possible to get the records of these young men?
Yes, good question. There is an organization called, I'll send you the link to it, called, I think, what's it called? CC Legacy, I believe. So it was the national organization for CCC enrollees, and as there are very few enrollees left now. They're the greatest generation, the youngest men of the greatest generation. But so this has become a program called CC Legacy, and it's actually located, its office is on that first camp that was built, Camp Roosevelt, that was started when the CCC began, and they keep the records, or they help people find records of CCC enrollees. And so they will, for a small price, I think, do the research at the National Archives where the CCC enrollees are kept, or for the CCC records are kept. And there are lists of the young men who were in the camps, and they will help, so you can find, if you want, you can find family members or find lists of names of men in the companies. All that information is in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And the CCC Legacy Program helps support that work.
Dawn would like to know, were there more enrollees interested than positions available? And if so, what did the selection process look like?
There were. That again, it was a transition. That again changed and I'll especially among the white enrollees. At the beginning, the competition was intense. And when we interviewed people, one man said that his dad was working, I think, a half a day a week, and he didn't qualify because there were so many families who had nothing. And then he said his best friend got in, and then he was walking home feeling pretty dejected, and then someone dropped out, just didn't want to do it at the last minute. And his friend came running down the street yelling, come back, they'll take you. And he walked back and was able to go into the CCC. Early on, the competition was that stiff. Later on, as the camps, there were a lot of camps, especially for the white enrollees. And there would be ads in the paper, we have space, come sign up, we have space, we have an opportunity here, we have work available, please sign up. So it became a much more relaxed way. People could pretty much go down to the relief office, and this was where they signed up. The young men it was hard. for some of them, it was hard for their families because they had to admit they needed relief. But that became such an overwhelming thing in especially the early years of the Great Depression that, you know, everybody, there were so many people who needed relief that the stigma of that wasn't as strong as it otherwise could have been. And relief wasn't what we call welfare today. Relief was a local system where you'd go to your town or your city council, your town board, and say, I have trouble. And they give you a bag of groceries or a gallon of gas for your car or something. It was a very public thing. It was a very difficult thing for people to deal with when they were down on their luck or having difficulties or illness or something that really prevented the family from continuing to work. And so, but this, of course, the Great Depression overwhelmed the system. And so that's why this program became a work relief. That's what it was called. The WPA was called a work relief program. Both of these programs were, you provided work to people who qualified for the need, qualified because of need. And so that was the case. It did become more informal as time went on, especially with the white enrollees. That was not the situation with the Black enrollees, and that 10% cap and the need for work among, you know, Minnesota's or among the nationally among the Black populations meant that there was always a demand for Black enrollees to go into the CCC, and that 10% cap meant that the only way a young Black man could go is if another young Black man left. And so, you know, there was really a lot of care. There was a lot of respect. There was a lot of, I would love to go in, but I don't want to take your place. I'm worried about taking someone else's place. And that continued throughout the program. And that's if you ever read a major criticism about the Civilian Conservation Corps, it's that was such a strict requirement. And that requirement was only there because there was a Black member of Congress who said, I want to be sure that Black enrollees would be allowed in. And so that's why it was written in. It was written in that there, you know, there would not be discrimination on the basis of color. But that 10% limit was Fechner. Fechner was an Army man, a Southerner, and a Union man, but he was an Army man and a Southerner. And he said, I'm going to keep this. He said, we're giving them the same camps as the white boys. They're separate, but they're just the same. They're equal. And as young white men, but the demand never let up, I don't think, for the Black enrollees. So that was, you know, it was a product of its time. And you could say that it's good that the non-discrimination clause was written in. It was also, you know, we wouldn't administer it that way today.
Jean would like to know, are you still in touch with any of your interviewees, or did you maintain contact after the project was over?
There were 100 of them. So obviously, yeah. Yeah, there were a few that we maintained contact with. We used to sometimes go to the reunions, which was fun, and just kind of hang out, which was a lot of fun. But not as many of them, no. They told their stories. There were wonderful stories from the Rochester area. I can tell you one or two of them. One man, I'll tell you two of them. One man described, in fact, I think it was the man who was then, whose quote I read at the beginning, said that his father had a really good business in the Rochester and southeastern Minnesota. And he and his two younger sisters had a comfortable life, and his mother and father. The father lost the business and he left. He couldn't face the family. The mother went to work, his mother went to work at another town. And the grandparents came, and one of his grandparents took one sister and one of his grandparents took another sister. And he said he stood in the middle of the street and watched them drive away. And he's about 15, 16 years old, or 16, 17. No, it wasn't the same person I quoted, but he was about 16, 17 years old. And so he got a job pasteurizing milk for the school system so that he'd have a place to live and something to eat, and then went into the CCC. And he was a very successful businessman in his own right. When he came in, and he said, if my voice is shaking, it's because I'm emotional about what happened to me at that age. And you can still hear it on the recording. But another one in southeastern Minnesota that was, and the camps, the work programs were organized so that there'd be a supervisor or a young man who had a work crew, and he'd be the head of the work crew, and he'd have 8 or 9 young men underneath him. And the head of the work crew might be 19 years old or 20, while all the enrollees, working with him were 18 years old. So there wasn't much age difference there. But that work crew leader was responsible for, out of making sure that the young men got the work done. Well, I wanted to interview a work crew leader, and sure enough, there was somebody living in Rochester who was a work crew leader. So I went to his house with my audio recorder. That's what I was using at the time. And his wife said, we decided to have a reunion. We had all the work crew come. And all these men were piling in. And I thought, how am I going to get, I've got lots of enrollee stories, but I really want the work crew leader story. And I was sitting there, and his wife was passing the beer around, and they were going, pop, pop, pop. And they were, oh, we haven't seen you in such a long time. They hadn't been together, and they were having a reunion. And they were all talking, and I was just kind of sitting there feeling a little sad that I didn't have a video recorder, among other things, and wondering what I was going to do. And all of a sudden, the work crew leader stood up, and he looked around the table, and he said, boys, it's my time to talk. Silence. You could tell the interrelationship between the work crew and the leader 50 years later. Silence. They all nodded, they all smiled, and he turned to me and he said, what do you want to know? And I turned on the recorder and got a great interview. And they had a good time in the process. But I just remember he stood up and said, boys, it's my time to talk. And they just listened to him. It was great.
So how long did it take you to conduct all those interviews?
Oh my goodness. We did a couple of years to do the original ones in northern Minnesota. And then I got a couple of grants from the Minnesota Historical Society to do some more. And the grants in southern Minnesota, southeastern Minnesota, were done with support from the Minnesota Historical Society grants program. And that was another couple of years, maybe. So overall 3 or 4 years, I think, to really pull all the interviews together. They're all up at the Iron Range Research Center, Iron World, whatever it's called now, up in the research center there. But then the other thing that the young men did, they pulled out scrapbooks, they pulled out newsletters, they pulled out they pulled out their trunks, the things that they had saved all those years. And they said, well, our kids don't want it. And why would the kids want it? And so they gave it to that organization as well up in northeastern Minnesota. And they ended up building a museum based on this oral history project. It not only has a book, it has a full museum. The captions and when you go in and the statements in they'll have all the material that they had. And then they, quotes from the interviews scattered all over the museum and that sort of thing. And so it was a very nice way of also remembering the Civilian Conservation Corps in Minnesota, because it's a tribute to their work across the state.
That's fantastic. You've mentioned the WPA a little bit, and I know we're talking about the PCC tonight, but could you just give us a brief overview of kind of the differences of those two programs?
Yeah, the WPA was the largest work program in the history of Works Project Administration. It came in 1935. There was a predecessor called the PWA, but there was a lot of controversy at this time about some of the programs that Franklin Roosevelt was putting into place, and the Supreme Court was trying to decide what to do with them. Are they constitutional or not? And so eventually, the final result was that the WPA was organized as Works Projects Administration. Eventually, the name, I think, was changed to Works Progress Administration, but the WPA came in 1935, and it became the largest work program. Now that employed men and women, and it employed them at home and employed them in their communities. So communities would apply for work projects, that work betterment projects in their communities. And then if the projects were approved, then that people were hired through the WPA. And they were given pretty much a living wage, but through the WPA to do the work. And so I know in Minnesota, a lot of schools were built, a lot of public buildings were built across the state. There there was a lot of work done like that in my hometown and my home county. I've just been looking at that in Nobles County in southern Minnesota. The roads were built there or paved. A lot of there were a lot of roads, rural roads paved. There was some electrification that was done through that in addition to the REA. And I know in my hometown, though, curb and gutter was put in and streets were paved, and that made a difference. They're still there. You can walk down the sidewalks and still see the WPA stamp on in the concrete. But so there were a lot of kind of just public works projects that were done across the country, and people were employed at a specific wage, at a pretty much a going wage, and or close to a going wage, enough to support families at the time, and they were hired locally. And so there'd be once a work project was developed, then they knew how many people they could hire, and they knew what kinds of people, what kinds of backgrounds they needed, or what, if you needed someone to lay concrete, or you need someone who was an electrician or something like that, you could do that kind of thing. And so they knew who would be needed and what would be needed, and pulled people in, and the preference was always, at least I know in our area, to hire locally.
Can you talk a little bit about what the requirements were to join the CCC? I know you said it's changed a little bit, but were there literacy requirements, age, marriage status, those kinds of things?
There were no literacy requirements. The young men had to be unmarried. They should be 18 to 25 years of age, and the family had to be on relief. Those were the major requirements. I think something like 10,000 young men learned to read in the camps. I believe they were illiterate. And shortly after a couple years after the CCC got going, there was this need. It was recognized that there was a need for educational programs in the camp, either because of illiteracy or because young men had not been forced to drop out of high school because of work needs and family needs and situations. And so there were a lot of programs, especially there were some in southeastern Minnesota, as I remember, where the camps partnered with local high schools so that the young men could go in at certain times during the day or have so many hours of education, or out-of-work educators were hired by the camps and brought in to teach the young men and help them get their GEDs, among other things. So there was an emphasis on supporting them and other ways than just doing the conservation work. But basically the age requirement and the relief requirement and unmarried were the kind of the big ones, were the major guidelines for going into the CCC.
Were there any programs for married men? We've talked about like fathers losing work or fathers only working part of the time. Clearly, there's still a need there.
There were. Now, WPA would be a program for the families. The veterans, I don't know. I don't know if they were married. The veterans camps. I should have looked that up, but I forget every once in a while. But I don't know that they were married. Or maybe they had to choose, or if they had families somewhere. But the veterans lived on site in veterans camps, and so they did not live at home. The CCC Indian Division was operated differently, and it allowed the people in the CCC to live at home, and the age requirements were much more flexible. So the head of a family could sign up and go into the CCC, live at home, and I think the age went up to age 40 or something like that, so that there was more flexibility in the camp systems. In the Indian Division, there were on-site camps. There were 2 of them in Minnesota where there were on-site camps, where the 200 young men would live in what looked like a standard CCC camp, but for the most part, those were done as employment opportunities on the reservations for families. And that would be similar to the WPA. The CCC and the WPA work together on projects as well sometimes, especially in the Indian Division camps in Minnesota with the Native American work. And so on Grand Portage, the CCC did work on conservation of the Grand Portage, what is now that national monument. But then the WPA came in and did some finishing work in that and hired people to do other types of work that were needed. So there were times when they worked together, depending on the situation.
And then I was wondering too, if you could tell us kind of what a daily schedule would look like for these men. You know, we've talked about them doing labor, but also they have to have meals, they're traveling, and like, what does that schedule, especially on a military regime, look like?
It was a military regime. It was absolutely a military regime. They got up in the morning at a certain time. There was lights out at night at a certain time. There were bed checks. They would try to sneak off and keep cars in the woods. Every once in a while, they go AWOL, you know, that sort of thing. But that was a very nice, strict regime, or a strict day. They'd get up in the morning, they'd have their breakfast. They had all they could eat, and they remembered a lot of potatoes and a lot of bread. They remembered a lot of pies. They talked about their meals a lot in the interviews because they were important to them. They remembered them well. But, and then they would go out and they would work for 8 hours a day. They'd take their sandwiches. They got 3 sandwiches a piece, they said, during the work days. And the trucks would come out with the food and with hot coffee and that sort of thing. And they'd take their lunch breaks out in the woods, and then they'd come back in and work. And then they'd have dinner. They'd have to clean up for dinner, and they'd go in and have their evening meal, I think. And then they had time. They had a hall where they could all gather, and they had, pool tables and ping pong tables and magazines and reading corners and that sort of thing. And that's also where they could take classes, I think, in certain areas. But they had a rec hall, so they could, they could gather in the evening, and they had time in the evening after dinner to gather and to do certain things. And if they were swimming on the weekend, if they were always near lakes, and so there was a lot of swimming and stuff going on. They hiked a lot on off times, or get passes to town, to whatever the nearest town was. But their day was very regimented, 8 hours a day in the conservation work. Get up, early, and then lights out by about 10 o'clock at night. And they were supposed to be there. And so it could get up and get ready to go the next morning. And they did. For the most part, they were happy. They were glad to be there. The camps were probably a little rough. There was a certain amount of fighting, and we have a lot of pictures of young men out boxing, and the army officers would say, "I don't want fighting in the camps. Put on the gloves, duke it out," and stuff. It was pretty basic in terms of the human resources management. But they worked things out as well, and they said they made friendships, a lot of them good friends, and they remembered it as for the most part, as a time that was that they appreciated.
So I don't see any other questions coming through on the chat. So I want to end with one last question for you, because I'm fascinated by this. What was your favorite story that you learned? You spent 3 or 4 years in interviews, you worked at the museum, but like, what's that one thing that sticks out to you? And it doesn't have to be southeastern Minnesota.
No, one of the things that sticks out, and it was sometimes the stories came through a lot. One of our first interviews, the man who was the cartographer, actually, there were a couple of things he said that you still remember. One of them was, as we started talking, all of a sudden he said, "Is it okay to talk about this?" My mother was so embarrassed that we were on relief. His dad was gone. And I said, "Yes, it is. It's okay now to talk about it. We really want to know what it was like for you." And then he started talking. And then he said, the food was plain, but he said, "Oh my gosh, it was so good to have all this food." And then he said, "Oh, my mother would feel so bad if she knew I said that, because she was a good cook and she couldn't provide for us." So I think there were a number of favorite stories, but it was the insight into what their lives were like, and what this, into what the Depression was like for young people. Because they were remembering back. They were thinking about, they were in their 70s and 80s and 90s, maybe even when I interviewed them, and they were remembering what it was like when they were teenagers. And it kind of came alive again in their interviews when they would talk about this, and they would talk about what it meant to them and what it was like. And that part, how do you know otherwise? What the past is like for someone, unless they could explain to you what it was like to have lived through that. And I think that was probably, for me, the biggest impact of the CCC interviews. And there were a number of stories like that. I just happen to remember that man lived in Duluth at the time that I interviewed him. He lived in Washington, D.C. for years, but he'd come back home then to Minnesota. and his just sudden insights. Oh my gosh, can I talk about this? Oh my gosh, my mother would feel so bad. He was almost in the reality of what it was like to be in the Depression again. And that happened a number of times.
Well, I am sorry to say that we're going to wrap up our program tonight, but thank you so much to our audience for asking so many great questions, and also to our presenter for sharing her time and expertise with us. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's program and that you continue to join us in the future as we discuss everything from modernism to traveling America and so much more. Check out our website at olmstedhistory.com to stay up to date on all of our events and programs. And if you enjoyed tonight's program, consider making a donation to help us continue to offer this and other great programs, or consider becoming a member. A History Center of Olmsted County membership offers a wide variety of benefits, including access to free and reduced cost events like this. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you, Abby, for having me. I really appreciate it. It's a delight to talk about this history.